that Rafik called me up and launched into a rapid-fire monologue. "We gotta talk, Barack," he said. "What y'all trying to do with the job training needs to fit into the overall comprehensive development plan I've been working on. Can't think about this thing in isolation. Gotta look at the big picture. You don't understand the forces at work out here. It's big, man. All kinds of folks ready to stab you in the back." I eventually gathered that Rafik had an interest in having the new training center we just proposed to the city located in a certain building near his office on Michigan Avenue. I didn't ask the particular nature of that interest. I doubted I could get a straight answer out of him, and anyway, I figured that we might be able to use Rafik as an ally in what was proving to be a series of sticky negotiations with the city. If the storefront he had in mind met the necessary specifications, I said, then I was willing to propose it as one possible alternative. So Rafik and I formed an uneasy alliance, one that didn't go over too well with the DCP leaders. I understood their concerns. Whenever we sat down with Rafik to discuss our joint strategy, he would interrupt the discussion with long lectures about secret machinations afoot and all the black people willing to sell folks down the river. It was an effective negotiating ploy, for with his voice progressively rising, the veins in his neck straining, leaders like Ruby would suddenly drop into a curious silence, watching Rafik as if he were an epileptic in the midst of a seizure. More than once, I'd have to jump in and start shouting back at him, not so much in anger as simply to slow him down, until finally a small smile would curl under his mustache and we could get back to work. When the two of us were alone, though, Rafik and I could sometimes have normal conversations. Over time, I arrived at a grudging admiration for his tenacity and bravado, and, within his own terms, a certain sincerity. He confirmed that he had been a gang leader growing up in the Oakdale Gardens public housing projects. He had found religion, he said, under the stewardship of a local Muslim leader, unaffiliated with Minister Louis Farrakhan's Nation of Islam. "If it hadn't been for Islam, man, I'd probably be dead," he told me one day. "Just had a negative attitude, you understand? Growing up in Oakdale, I'd soak up all the poison the white man feeds us. See, the folks you're working with got the same problem, even though they don't realize it yet. They spend half their lives worrying about what white folks think. Start blaming themselves for the shit they see every day, thinking they can't do no better till the white man decides they all right. But deep down, they know that ain't right. They know what this country has done to their mama, their daddy, their sister. So the truth is they hate white folk, but they can't admit it to themselves. Keep it all bottled up, fighting themselves. Waste a lot of energy that way. I tell you one thing I admire about white folks," Rafik continued. "They know who they are. Look at the Italians. They didn't care about the American flag and all that when they got here. First thing they did was put together the mafia to make sure their interests were met. The Irish, they took over the city hall, found their boys some jobs. The Jews, same thing. You telling me they care more about some black kid on the south side than they do about relatives in Israel? Shit. It's about blood, Barack. Looking after your own. Period. Black people the only ones stupid enough to worry about their enemies." "In hands," the Reverend said, as we kneel and pray at the foot of an old rugged cross. "Yes. Lord, we come first to thank you for what you've already done for us. We come to thank you most of all for Jesus. Lord, we come from different walks of life, some considered high and some low, but all on equal ground at the foot of this cross. Lord, thank you. For Jesus, Lord, our burden bearer and heavy load sharer, we thank you." The title of Reverend Wright's sermon that morning was The Audacity of Hope. He began with a passage from the book of Samuel, the story of Hannah, who, barren and taunted by her rivals, had wept and shaken in prayer before her God. The story reminded him, Reverend Wright said, of a sermon a fellow pastor had preached at a conference some years before, in which the pastor described going to a museum and being confronted by a painting titled Hope. The painting depicts a harpist, Reverend Wright explained, a woman who at first glance appears to be sitting atop a great mountain, until you take a closer look and see that the woman is bruised and bloodied, dressed in tattered rags, the harp reduced to a single frayed string. Your eye is then drawn down to the scene below, down to the valley below, where everywhere are the ravages of famine, the drumbeat of war, a world groaning under strife and deprivation. It is this world, a world where cruise ships throw away more food in a day than most residents of Port-au-Prince see in a year, where white folks' greed runs a world in need, apartheid in one hemisphere, apathy in another hemisphere. That's the world. on which hope sits. I had grown accustomed everywhere to suspicion between the races. But whether because of New York's density or because of its scale, it was only now that I began to grasp the almost mathematical precision with which America's race and class problems joined. The depth, the ferocity of resulting tribal wars, the bile that flowed freely not just out on the streets but in the stalls of Columbia's bathrooms as well, where no matter how many times the administration tried to paint over them, the walls remained scratched with blunt correspondence between niggers and kikes. It was as if all middle ground had collapsed, utterly, and nowhere, it seemed, was that collapse more apparent than in the black community I had so lovingly imagined and within which I had hoped to find refuge. I might meet a black friend at his midtown law firm, and before heading to lunch at the MoMA, I would look out across the city toward the East River from his high-rise office, imagining a satisfactory life for myself, a vocation, a family, a home, until I noticed that the only other blacks in the office were messengers or clerks. The only other blacks in the museum, the blue-jacketed security guards who counted the hours before they could catch their trains home to Brooklyn or Queens. I might wander through Harlem to play on courts I'd once read about, or to hear Jesse Jackson make a speech on 125th. Or, on a rare Sunday morning, to sit in the back pews of Abyssinian Baptist Church, lifted by the gospel choir's sweet, sorrowful song, and catch a fleeting glimpse of that thing which I sought. But I had no guide that might show me how to join this troubled world. And when I looked for an apartment there, I found Sugar Hill's elegant brownstones occupied and out of reach, the few decent rental buildings with 10-year-long waiting lists, so that all that remained were the rows and rows of uninhabitable tenements, in front of which young men counted out their rolls of large bills, and winos slouched and stumbled and wept softly to themselves. I took all this as a personal affront, a mockery of my tender ambitions, although when I brought up the subject with people who had lived in New York for a while, I was told there was nothing original about my observations. The city was out of control, they said, the polarization a natural phenomenon, like monsoons or continental drift. Political discussions, the kind that at Occidental had once seemed so intense and purposeful, came to take on the flavor of the socialist conferences I sometimes attended at Cooper Union, or the African cultural fairs that took place in Harlem and Brooklyn during the summers, a few of the many diversions New York had to offer, like going to a foreign film or ice skating at Rockefeller Center. With a bit of money, I was free to live like most middle-class blacks in Manhattan, free to choose a motif around which to organize my life, free to patch together a collage of styles, friends, watering holes, political affiliations. I sensed, though, that at some stage, maybe when you had children and decided you could stay in the city only at the cost of a private school, or when you began taking cabs at night to avoid the subways, or when you decided that you needed a doorman in your apartment building, your choice was irrevocable, the divide was now impassable, and you would find yourself on the side of the line that you'd never intended to be on. Unwilling to make that choice, I spent a year walking from one end of Manhattan to the other. Like a tourist, I watched the range of human possibility on display, trying to trace out my future in the lives of the people I saw, looking for some opening through which I could re-enter. I spent the last 2 years of high school in a daze, locking away the questions that life seemed insistent on posing. I kept playing basketball, attended classes sparingly, drank beer heavily, and tried drugs enthusiastically. I discovered that it didn't make any difference whether you smoked reefer in the white classmate's sparkling new van, or in the dorm room with some brother you'd met down at the gym, or on the beach with a couple of Hawaiian kids who had dropped out of school and now spent most of their time looking for an excuse to brawl. Nobody asked you whether your father was a fat cat executive who cheated on his wife, or some laid-off Joe who slapped you around whenever he bothered to come home. You might just be bored, or alone. Everybody was welcome into the club of disaffection, and if the high didn't solve whatever it was that was getting you down, it could at least help you laugh at the world's ongoing folly and see through all the hypocrisy and bullshit and cheap moralism. That's how it had seemed to me then, anyway. It had taken a couple of years before I saw how fates were beginning to play themselves out, the difference that color and money made after all, and who survived, how soft or hard the landing when you finally fell. I tried to explain some of this to my mother once, the role of luck in the world, the spin of the wheel. It was at the start of my senior year in high school. She was back in Hawaii, her field work completed, and one day she marched into my room wanting to know the details of my friend Pablo's recent arrest. I'd given her a reassuring smile and patted her hand and told her not to worry. I wouldn't do anything stupid. It was usually an effective tactic, Another one of those tricks I had learned.